In 1958, a 23-year-old jazz musician named Alexei Kozlov walked into a basement on the outskirts of Moscow, and what he found inside would eventually put him on a KGB watch list for the next 15 years. The place had no sign outside, no official name, and no license to operate. Yet inside, nearly 100 young Soviets were dancing to American rhythm and blues records smuggled across the Finnish border on X-ray film. How did a country that controlled every factory, every newspaper, and every apartment block fail to stop its own citizens from building an underground nightlife? And why did the Soviet state treat a roomful of dancing people as a threat to national security? To understand this, you have to abandon almost everything you assume about nightlife. In the West, a nightclub is a business. Someone leases a space, gets a liquor license, hires a DJ, and opens the doors. In the Soviet Union, there was no private enterprise. There were no liquor licenses because there was no licensing framework for private entertainment. Every venue in the country, every restaurant, every concert hall, every cinema was owned by the state, managed by a state committee, and subject to approval by local Communist Party officials. The idea that a group of citizens might independently gather in a room, play music the state had not approved, serve drinks the state had not distributed, and charge an informal entry fee was not just illegal. It was, in the ideological framework of the USSR, an act of economic and cultural sabotage. And yet it happened. It happened constantly. It happened in Moscow, Leningrad, Tbilisi, Riga, Tallinn, and Odessa. It happened in factory basements, in the back rooms of state-run restaurants, in apartment courtyards, and on riverboats anchored far enough from shore that the local militia couldn't easily reach them. The Soviet Union did not have nightclubs in the way the West understood them, but it had something far more interesting: a shifting, improvised, semi-legal, and occasionally very dangerous network of underground social venues that existed in the gray zones of Soviet law. And understanding how they worked reveals something essential about the nature of the Soviet system itself. Let's start with what was legal. From the late 1920s onward, the Soviet state recognized that citizens needed some form of organized leisure. The vehicle for this was the House of Culture, the Dom Kultury, a state-funded community center found in nearly every Soviet city and many towns. Houses of culture hosted amateur theater groups, chess clubs, poetry readings, folk dance ensembles, and, crucially, dances. These dances were the closest thing the Soviet Union had to an officially sanctioned nightlife. They were held on weekend evenings, typically in a large hall with a live band, an approved ensemble playing from an approved repertoire. Admission was cheap, sometimes free. Alcohol was not served on the premises, though everyone knew that attendees brought bottles in coat pockets and handbags. The atmosphere was supervised. A kulturnik, a sort of cultural supervisor, was often present to ensure that dancing remained within the bounds of decency and that the music did not stray into ideologically suspect genres. If you're someone who enjoys uncovering how power actually functioned behind the Iron Curtain, not the propaganda version, not the Hollywood version, but the documented, messy human reality, then consider subscribing. This channel exists to pull apart the machinery of Soviet and Cold War history, and there's a lot more coming that you won't want to miss. Now, the problem with the houses of culture was simple. They were boring. The bands played the same repertoire of approved Soviet popular songs and folk standards. The dances were waltz, polka, and occasionally a tightly controlled foxtrot. The atmosphere was institutional fluorescent lighting, portraits of Lenin on the walls, and the ever-present kulturnik ready to intervene if anyone danced too close together or appeared intoxicated. For young people in the 1950s and 1960s, young people who had caught fragments of American jazz on Voice of America broadcasts, who had seen photographs of Parisian cafes in smuggled magazines, who had heard Elvis Presley on records pressed onto discarded hospital X-ray plates, the famous ribs or bones of the Soviet bootleg music trade, the House of Culture dance was unbearable. It was their parents' world. It was everything they wanted to escape. And so the Stilyagi appeared. The Stilyagi, the name translates roughly as style hunters or style chasers, were the Soviet Union's first recognizable youth subculture. They emerged in the late 1940s among the children of Moscow's elite, diplomats' kids, the sons and daughters of high-ranking military officers, young people who had some access to Western goods and media. They wore narrow trousers, bright ties, thick-soled shoes. They styled their hair in pompadours. They danced the boogie-woogie. And they gathered in places that were not houses of culture. The Styliagi haunted certain Moscow streets. Gorky Street was a favorite, and they began to colonize the few spaces where something resembling a free social atmosphere could exist. Certain state-run cafes became known as Styliagi hangouts. The cocktail hall on Gorky Street, which opened in 1944, and was one of the few places in Moscow serving mixed drinks, became a de facto social club for the movement. The Moscow restaurant Aragvi, famous for its Georgian cuisine, attracted a crowd that pushed the boundaries of acceptable Soviet behavior. These weren't nightclubs in any formal sense, but they functioned as nightlife nodes, places where the young, the fashionable, and the rebellious congregated after dark, where the music was a little louder, the conversations a little more dangerous, and the surveillance a little harder for the authorities to maintain. The state noticed. A 1953 Pravda editorial attacked the Styliagi as parasites who worshipped Western decadence. Komsomol brigades, groups of young Communist League members, were organized to patrol known Styliagi gathering spots. Their methods were direct and humiliating. They would surround a young man in narrow trousers, cut the trousers open with scissors, and leave him standing in the street in his underwear. They would seize girls wearing lipstick and publicly wipe it off their faces. Photographs of offenders were posted in workplaces and universities under the heading "They disgrace our society." The message was clear: your leisure time belongs to the collective, and the collective does not dance the boogie-woogie. But repression and desire are not opposites. In Soviet history, they were collaborators. Every crackdown on informal nightlife pushed it further underground, which made it more thrilling, more exclusive, and paradoxically more attractive. By the late 1950s and into the 1960s, the Khrushchev thaw, when censorship loosened slightly and cultural experimentation became marginally more tolerable, the underground nightlife scene didn't shrink. It exploded. This is where the story gets genuinely dangerous. The key figure to understand is not a musician or a dancer, but a fixer, a particular Soviet social type that has no clean Western equivalent. In Russian, these people were sometimes called tolkachi, literally pushers, though in the nightlife context, they were simply the people who made things happen. They found the spaces. They bribed the building managers. They arranged for sound equipment, which was almost impossible to obtain privately. They sourced alcohol from state stores or, more often, from black market networks. They managed the guest list, which was critical. One informant in the room could bring the entire operation crashing down. Consider the case of a man known in KGB files as Lev S., who between 1962 and 1967 organized a series of underground dance parties in Leningrad. Records declassified in the 1990s describe his operation in remarkable detail. Lev rented basement storage rooms in large apartment blocks, telling building superintendents that he needed the space for furniture repair. He brought in a reel-to-reel tape player, an East German Grundig, itself a piece of contraband, and a set of speakers cannibalized from a factory public address system. He charged 3 rubles at the door. For context, the average Soviet monthly salary in 1965 was around 90 rubles, so 3 rubles was not insignificant, roughly equivalent to the price of 4 kilograms of beef. The parties ran from 10 at night until 3 or 4 in the morning. They featured jazz, twist music, and increasingly rock and roll recorded from Western radio broadcasts. Lev employed 2 lookouts stationed near the building's entrances who could signal if militia patrols approached. When a warning came, the music stopped instantly, the lights went up, and the tape reels were hidden inside a hollowed-out section of wall. Lev's operation lasted 5 years. That is an astonishing duration in a surveillance state. It ended not because of a militia raid, but because one of his regular attendees, a university student named Dmitry, was arrested for an unrelated black market currency offense and, under interrogation, revealed the parties. Lev was charged under Article 154 of the Russian Soviet Criminal Code, private entrepreneurial activity, and sentenced to 2 years in a corrective labor colony. The charge was economic, not cultural. The state did not prosecute him for playing Western music. It prosecuted him for collecting money at the door. This distinction matters enormously. The Soviet system was often less concerned with what people did in private than with any sign that a parallel economy was emerging outside state control. A room full of people dancing to jazz was a cultural nuisance. A room full of people paying a private citizen to dance to jazz was an economic threat. But there was another dimension to the danger of Soviet nightlife, and it had nothing to do with economics. It had to do with what happened when people gathered in unmonitored spaces and talked. The KGB's concern with informal social gatherings was not paranoia in the clinical sense. It was, from the regime's perspective, rational. Underground parties were places where people shared information the state did not want shared. They were places where foreign radio broadcasts were discussed openly. There were places where jokes about the leadership circulated, and in the Soviet Union, a political joke told to the wrong person could result in a camp sentence. A 1971 internal KGB memorandum obtained by the Bukovsky archives specifically identified uncontrolled youth gatherings with musical accompaniment as potential vectors for anti-Soviet agitation. The memo recommended increased infiltration of such events using undercover agents recruited from Komsomol organizations. The irony, and this is a pattern interrupt worth sitting with, is that some of the most vibrant nightlife scenes in the Soviet Union emerged not in the relatively liberal cities of Moscow and Leningrad, but in the Baltic republics, particularly Estonia and Latvia, where local Communist Party officials had a quietly different relationship with Western culture. Tallinn, the capital of Soviet Estonia, was close enough to Helsinki to receive Finnish television signals, which meant that by the 1970s, Estonian youth were watching Western advertisements, Western pop music programs, and Western films on a nightly basis. The city's authorities, while publicly enforcing Soviet cultural norms, were privately more permissive. Certain Tallinn restaurants and hotel bars operated with a degree of freedom that would have been unthinkable in Moscow. The bar at the Hotel Viru, for instance, which in one of history's richer ironies was later revealed to have been comprehensively bugged by the KGB, with an entire floor of the hotel dedicated to surveillance equipment, functioned as something remarkably close to a Western cocktail bar. It served imported drinks. It had a live band that played Western standards. Foreign tourists and local Estonians mixed freely. The atmosphere was cosmopolitan in a way that the rest of the Soviet Union could barely imagine. And then there was Georgia. Tbilisi in the 1970s had a nightlife reputation that was legendary across the entire USSR. Georgian culture had always placed enormous value on feasting, drinking, and music, and the Georgian Communist Party, under leaders like Eduard Shevardnadze, ran a republic that was by Soviet standards spectacularly corrupt, which is to say, it was a place where money moved in unofficial channels, where private enterprise thrived behind a thin veil of socialist rhetoric, and where a culture of hospitality created spaces that were functionally indistinguishable from private clubs. Certain Tbilisi restaurants, establishments like the Aragvai on Shota Rustaveli Avenue, or the countless small taverns in the Old Town, operated as evening social venues where wine flowed, musicians played until dawn, and the boundary between a dinner party and a nightclub was essentially non-existent. The Georgian toast tradition, elaborate, performative, emotionally charged, turned every large gathering into a theatrical event. If you were a young Soviet from Novosibirsk or Sverdlovsk, a trip to Tbilisi was the closest you could get to experiencing nightlife without leaving the country. But the real transformation of Soviet nightlife came in the 1980s, during the years of Gorbachev's reforms, and it came with a twist that nobody expected: the anti-alcohol campaign. In May 1985, Gorbachev launched a sweeping campaign to reduce alcohol consumption in the Soviet Union. Vodka production was cut, liquor stores had their hours restricted, vineyards in Moldova, Georgia, and Crimea were ripped out, an act of agricultural destruction that still scars the region's wine industry today. Alcohol prices rose sharply. The campaign was, by most measures, a public health success in the short term. Alcohol-related deaths dropped, male life expectancy briefly rose, but its effect on nightlife was catastrophic and paradoxically energizing. State-run restaurants, which had served as the de facto evening social venues for Soviet adults, saw their alcohol supplies cut or eliminated. The official dance halls and houses of culture were already dry. The result was that anyone who wanted to drink and socialize in the evening was pushed decisively into the underground. Homebrew production, samagon, surged. Black market alcohol became a major industry almost overnight, and the underground party scene, which had been simmering for decades, boiled over. The late 1980s saw the emergence of the first venues that genuinely resembled Western nightclubs. In Moscow, a place called the Moloko, named after the milk bar in A Clockwork Orange, which tells you everything about the cultural references these young Soviets were consuming, opened in a repurposed basement and hosted rock bands, DJs playing new wave music, and a crowd dressed in styles imported directly from London and New York. In Leningrad, the rock club movement centered around the Leningrad Rock Club at 13 Rubinstein Street, officially a Komsomol-supervised venue, but in practice a barely controlled cauldron of punk, post-punk, and new wave generated bands like Kino, Aquarium, and DDT, whose concerts functioned as massive, transcendent nightlife events. Viktor Tsoi, the lead singer of Kino, became the closest thing the late Soviet Union had to a genuine rock star, and his concerts were not just musical performances, they were communal experiences of a society on the verge of disintegration, where thousands of young people gathered in the dark and sang along to lyrics about change, about waiting, about a world that was clearly ending but hadn't yet figured out what would come next. The danger in this period was no longer primarily legal, though arrests still happened. It was physical. Underground venues had no fire codes, no safety inspections, no emergency exits. Overcrowding was routine. Electrical systems were improvised. In 1987, a fire broke out at an unofficial party in a factory basement in Kharkov, Ukraine. Sources differ on the exact casualty count. Some reports say 3 dead, others say 7, but the event was covered up by local authorities and never acknowledged in official media. The silence was itself a form of violence. The dead went officially unrecognized, their families given no public recourse, because the event had taken place in a space that, according to the state, did not exist. There is something deeply revealing in this detail. The Soviet Union could build nuclear submarines and launch satellites into orbit, but it could not or would not create a framework in which its citizens could safely gather for an evening of music and dancing without state supervision. The absence of legal nightlife was not an oversight, it was a design feature. The Soviet social contract, such as it was, demanded that collective institutions mediate every aspect of life: work, housing, education, healthcare, leisure. An independent nightclub, a space where people gathered voluntarily, paid privately, and experienced pleasure on their own terms, represented a crack in the architecture of total social management. It was a space the state could not narrate. And in a system built on narration, on the story of collective progress, of worker solidarity, of ideological unity, a space without a narrative was terrifying. By 1991, as the Soviet Union collapsed, the underground nightlife scene didn't emerge into the light so much as it erupted. Moscow's first openly commercial nightclubs appeared almost overnight. The most famous of these early venues, places like the Hermitage, the Pilot, and later the legendary Titanic, were run by figures who came from the fringes of Soviet society: musicians, black market traders, former athletes, and in many cases, outright criminals. The Russian nightclub scene of the 1990s was famously dangerous, marked by shootings, protection rackets, and the heavy involvement of organized crime. But this violence was not a break from the Soviet past. It was, in a very direct sense, its product. Decades of pushing nightlife underground had ensured that the only people with the skills, the networks, and the ruthlessness to run entertainment venues were people who had learned to operate outside the law. The Soviet Union did not prevent a nightclub culture from forming. It ensured that, when one finally did form, it would be shaped by the logic of the underground. Looking back across this history, what strikes me is not the repression itself. Repressive states throughout history have tried to control how their populations spend their evenings. What strikes me is the persistence of the impulse. Every generation of Soviet citizens, from the Stiliagi of the 1940s to the rock fans of the 1980s, found ways to carve out spaces for unsupervised pleasure, and they did it knowing the costs. They risked their university placements, their jobs, their freedom, and occasionally their lives, not for political revolution, but for something much more basic: the right to choose their own music, their own company, and their own darkness. The Soviet experiment proved many things, but one of its most human lessons is this: you can nationalize industry, you can collectivize agriculture, you can censor the press and seal the borders, but you cannot nationalize the night. The night belongs to whoever is willing to take it.